Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I think most of you know me, but just in case, I'm Carol Golden, Chair of Housing Initiatives at Princeton. I'm glad you've joined us for this virtual experiment today, and we'll proceed with the garden party in a moment. But before we do, we felt it was important to acknowledge what's going on in our country. Like all of you, we saw what happened in Minneapolis, and we at HIP joined the nation in mourning the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, and the many other Black people whose lives have been ended by racially biased police brutality and the broader conditions of systemic racism in the country. Since our beginning, Housing Initiatives has supported social, economic, and racial justice in our community. It's the core of our being, and it's really one of the reasons we're here today. I recently heard Reverend William Barber, the minister and political activist, speak of interlocking injustices in describing the many faceted ways that systemic racism causes Black people and people living the lower end of the income scale to suffer in our society. And one of these interlocking injustices is, of course, manifested in the pervasive affordable housing crisis that the country was in even before the current health and economic crisis that was caused by COVID-19. According to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, the housing emergency in the US most harms people of color, and structural racism leaves them disproportionately low income, rent burdened, or homeless. We encourage our members and our attendees today to consider how each of us might work to dismantle this systemic injustice in our country. Thanks. And now I'll turn the mic over to our lovely hostess for the day, Judy Sarvery, who is with HIP Board Vice Chair, Deborah Agnew. Judy?
Hello, everybody. You've brought all your friends with you. How wonderful. Please come in. I hope you didn't have any trouble parking out there.
No, actually it was very easy.
So I know a lot of faces out there, but I probably don't know everybody, and you might not know me. So I'm Judy Sarvery, and my husband Mark is here too, but he's actually the other side of the camera, so I'm afraid you won't get to see him. But together we welcome you to our garden, and thank you so much for coming. So please, this way. Do mind your hats on this low hanging branch. The birds just love this tree, but they make a bit of a mess. Then I would just like to introduce the wonderful musicians we have with us today. We have John, Gabrielle, and Victoria Zamet, and we have Sam Weinglass. And they're just managing to play, losing their music to the wind and whatever, but you know, I think I'm going to try and keep them here all summer. They're just wonderful. So welcome to the garden.
It's gorgeous. Thank you.
You're welcome. And you know, when I first volunteered my garden to the HIP annual garden party, which is a very important fundraiser for HIP, by the way, I envisaged a lawn with lovely ladies and gentlemen sipping tea, maybe a game of croquet, but I'm afraid the world had other plans. And while you can't be here in person, and I wish you could be, we are so grateful that you have joined us from your own gardens. And I'm sure, like me, many of you have had moments of reflection over the past few weeks. And for me, one of the things I've so appreciated is having a home, having a space where I feel safe, where I can work or read, or cook for my family without worry. And I know you will all agree that these times are really exacerbating the situation for many people who are struggling to pay their rent and maybe are even facing eviction. So let's not forget why we gathered here today. So Deborah, may I offer you some tea?
Yeah, I'd love some
and
tea.
In fact, some scones.
You mean scones, Judy?
No, I think having scones, Deborah.
I'd love a scone. Thank you.
Go right ahead. We'll take some tea.
Yeah, thank you.
Now these scones, Mark baked them, but in fact, I think you...
Yes, well, thank you very much to Lily Pies and our advanced sponsors for these delicious scones. I'm going to enjoy this. Thank you.
Good. So as you could see, we were having a little debate, Deborah and I, about whether we pronounce it scones or scones. Now, you have actually, I think, been to a Queen's Garden party, am I right?
I have. She actually has quite a few every year.
I didn't know that.
Yes, so I wonder if people know how many garden parties. But the problem is that this year she's had to cancel them all.
That's right, I did hear that. Well,
Yeah.
then it's up to us to take up the mantle.
Yes.
Now, we're managing to do it on Zoom. I wonder why the Queen can't.
Yes. So I wonder if people know how many garden parties she
I don't
has.
know. Or maybe how much tea is consumed.
Well, I know there were a lot of people, but I have no idea how many cups of tea. I think it would be an awful lot, though.
I think maybe we should poll the audience. What do you think?
Well, there we go. The poll is up. So, for those of you watching at home, this is your opportunity to help your fellow tea partiers by guessing how many garden parties the Queen holds, how many cups of tea are served, and how is the correct pronunciation of scone. And I don't want to mislead you there, but so please go ahead and vote if you can.
So, how are the scones?
Scones were delicious. Thank you.
Good.
Absolutely delicious. And do we have any votes up yet, Mark?
Not yet. It's being tabulated by our accountants at the moment. But we'll report back as soon as we have information.
So what do you think, Judy? I guess 3 garden parties a year.
Sounds about right. I'd never honestly thought about it, not
Yeah.
having ever been invited.
And
But
cups of tea.
Well, I mean, how many people attend a garden party?
I have no idea.
Lots.
Yeah, but really I have no idea. Thousands of cups of tea?
Could
Well,
be.
here we have some answers, and so we're going to check how informed our audience is. We'll start with how many garden parties does Queen Elizabeth hold, and the majority of our team correctly guessed 4. Although we didn't trick them by saying how many at Buckingham Palace, because it's 3 at Buckingham Palace and 1 at Holyrood House. How many cups of tea are served? Nobody had the nerve, or very few, to guess. One person had the nerve to guess the correct answer of 27,000
My
cups of tea are
goodness.
served.
Goodness
at one of these
me.
parties. And finally, how do you pronounce scone? Is it as in scone, or stone, as in scone as in stone? 82% of the audience said stone. And while it is 50-50, pretty much in England, in the United Kingdom, I mean, how you pronounce it, I just want to make clear that the correct pronunciation is as in swan, it's scone. So I don't want to bias anybody. Okay, so that very, very informed audience we have here.
Well, thank you for participating in our
Yeah.
poll and for settling some unanswered questions here. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to Carol.
Thanks, Judy and Deborah. That was fun and informative. I've tried to get those musicians to actually come and play at my house, but I request Springsteen and they look at me like I'm a little crazy. But thanks again for being here, everybody. HIP has always envisioned the Princeton area as a diverse community where low-income families thrive with secure housing, employment, and education. So many people in our area live from paycheck to paycheck, and their lives and well-being are vulnerable to any number of setbacks. HIP's job is to provide transitional housing with wraparound services to low-income workers and their families, as well as emergency rental assistance that helps families facing a financial setback pay their rent and stay in their homes. And now the economic crisis that the pandemic has sparked is resulting in so many families in debt, unable to pay rent, and food insecure. HIP's mission and a more robust social safety net in general are needed now more than ever. Today, we're lucky enough to have an expert who will share some of his research and insights on the impact that debt has on people's well-being. I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Frederick Wary. Dr. Wary is the Townsend Martin Class of 1917 Professor of Sociology at Princeton University and the Director of the Dignity and Debt Network, which is a partnership between the Social Science Research Council and Princeton. He's the author of The Culture of Markets and the Philadelphia Barrio, among many other publications. We're so lucky that he's here today to talk about debt and dignity and economic justice. HIP board member Mishi Knight will facilitate a Q&A after his talk, so feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box on your Zoom screen at the bottom of your Zoom screen or in the chat box. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Wary.
So thank you so much for having me here today. I'm going to be brief. I'm typically not so brief, but I will be today, and talk for about 15 minutes or so about mistakes. We all make mistakes. And when we think about mistakes, we're thinking about actions that are somehow misguided or that miss the mark. And sometimes we make mistakes because we misidentify our target, so we have the wrong goal. At other times, the goal is clear, and somehow we are on pathways that are taking us anywhere but to that goal. And this becomes especially frustrating when looking at people who are facing financial insecurity, who should know better, who may be linked to the right set of self-help resources and are still making consequential mistakes. For some of us who have seen this firsthand, it is frustrating, it's maddening, and one wonders, is there something sort of, what's wrong here? Why is there so much madness in the situation? And what I'm going to do is talk through the method to the madness. And so I'm going to start with two stories that help illustrate how some of these mistakes are patterned. And then the first, and this is a story that a group of lawyers tells about their work working with tenants who are going to court to defend themselves against landlords. And what's most frustrating in these situations, of course, is when there's a tenant who has access to the right kinds of self-help materials, has met with staff at a legal clinic, has taken photographs that are damning about the conditions of the apartment, has the proper paperwork, and is aware of the laws and the regulations that protect her. She went to court with the knowledge that she needed, and somehow she failed to use any of the materials that were at her disposal. At the end of the proceedings, she found herself with 30 days to move out of the apartment and with an agreement to pay back lots of money that she would need for finding a new place to live. So what happened? When they spoke with her, she simply noted that when she went into the courtroom, it was a little confusing. She didn't know where to sit, when to stand up. Everyone else knew what to do. She did not. She felt and she was out of place. The other thing that the lawyers noted with her case and with many other cases is this sense that people walk in knowing that they're out of place, feeling embarrassed, feeling as if they're not respected, and freezing up as a result of that, not being able to use the knowledge and the resources at hand by virtue of the sense of either shame, embarrassment, guilt, or disrespect. And what they then asked themselves was, is there something that needs to happen on the social service side and on the provider side in the legal clinics to help people affirm their sense of self and to not feel so out of place so that they can deploy the knowledge that they have available. A few months ago, about 2 months before the pandemic shut everything down, including face-to-face research, I was engaged in an interview with someone in this area. And I talked to her about her experience with debt collectors. We'll call her Sarah. She's one of the roughly 77 million adults in the US who have had a debt turned over to a private debt collector. And she explained that her trouble started when her husband died in a car crash, and she took on debts in order to try to maintain the standard of living that her children enjoyed before his death. As she put it, they had gone through enough. But of course, in her efforts to maintain a sense of normality for her children, they then found themselves put out of the house. In fact, they've moved 3 times since his death. And when I spoke to her about that experience, one of the things that she did is she reached into her purse and she pulled out a stack of letters from debt collectors. And she opened those letters and she said, let's just go through them one by one so I can talk you through what happened with each of these. And then the other thing that was happening at this point is that I started looking at how much she owed. And I then had to ask, how much income do you have each month? And so she has a $1,400 disability check, but she noted that some months she loses almost $400 just to the bank because she has overdraft protection. And she uses this overdraft protection as her lifeline because the money starts to run out. She doesn't want to ask anyone else for help because most of the people she knows are struggling just as she is. And she feels embarrassed to even tell me this because she promised her financial counselor that she was going to close out this overdraft function. The sad thing about this is that she was at a mainstream bank, Bank of America, and so she wasn't someone who is unbanked, and she wasn't someone who didn't realize that she would have to pay these fees at the end of the month. But the overdraft function helped her keep her head up. And sometimes by trying to keep our heads up, a sense of self-respect, we find ourselves paying dearly for it. The other thing that I learned from her was that she herself had a wide range of experiences with debt collectors. So I asked her, because this is what we do as sociologists, we want to know the good and the bad. So I asked her, can you tell me about a positive experience you had with the collector? And at that point, she informed me that there was a fellow who's really very nice. He calls from the hospital. He asks her how she's doing. He affirms that she is making an effort. And he basically says, you know, we really want to work with you. Pay what you can. We can see that you're trying. And then I asked her for the contrasting case. Can you tell me a moment that felt not helpful or somehow negative? And then she described a debt collector calling her and telling her that he was just going to stop calling. There was no need to even have a conversation with her because she never intended to pay the debt. That in fact, she was someone who was a cheat, and was dishonest, and was not to be trusted. And what she noted was that this was just not right. She said it was disrespectful, and it did not in any way acknowledge that she was trying. And so all she wanted him to do is to work with her, find a way to work with her. She said, I want them to call me, I want to pay it, but I just need them to come up with terms that I can meet. And so across these cases, what we're seeing is that there are people who are having trouble processing what to prioritize, how to come up with a plan. And they're doing this when their resources are such that sometimes they agree to plans that they know they can't meet, but they do it in order to evade shame. So one of the questions that some of us are asking now is, how do we structure our interactions with clients as service providers? How do we structure our interactions with clients when they're in banks and in other financial service situations? And how does the structure of that encounter lead them to make predictable mistakes? And to what extent might some of these environments that lead to these mistakes be intentional or unintentional. So one of the things that most people don't realize is that the debt collection industry, it's pretty lucrative. In '93, the face value of debts in that industry was only $6 billion. By 2013, it risen to $98 billion, and the revenue stood around $11.5 billion in 2018. And so there are people who have done some work to try to understand how do debt collectors themselves take advantage of the fact that people want to keep their heads lifted in order to get them to sometimes pay debts that that they legally don't have to pay. The other thing too that we don't often realize is that when you have a low income and you are facing debt collection, you're more likely to have that collection turned over to the court. So if you have an income, household income of $20,000 or less, you have a 1 in 5 of those households facing debt collection are sued. For those households with earning more than $70,000, it then moves from 1 in 5 to 1 in 10. And so the less you have available to you, the more strain those resources are going to be placed under. And so this means that in this time in which the COVID-19 pandemic has forced a number of people into unemployment, and for those who are not unemployed, they have suffered salary cuts, and they have found themselves taking on additional debts in order to kind of make life as normal as possible, and or to support family members who are doing less well than they are. This means that we should expect financial insecurity to be on a sharp increase, and we should also expect debt collection to be at an all-time high as this pandemic unfolds. The final thing that I'll say here is one of the things that we need to be spending quite a bit more time thinking about is what to do about people who make costly mistakes. And it's okay to be frustrated, but it's not okay to abandon them. So one of the sources of frustration is in particular where we see people who could have taken other pathways. And so when you talk to people who are on the front line of service delivery, they have heartbreaking stories of situations that did not need to unravel in the way that they did. And so one of the things that we have to try to do is try to understand the difference between individuals' choices and how those choices are being influenced by the structure of the situations in which they're in. It doesn't mean that that there is no personal responsibility. It just means that the various responsibilities for these mistakes get assigned appropriately. And then the final thing that I'll say is that I hope that as you do your work in this time, that you remember that there are going to be a number of people who are going to be facing housing insecurity and food insecurity who have not faced this before. And they are going to be more likely to make the mistake of waiting to pursue assistance. And in that long wait of pursuing assistance, they are going to also be more likely to fall into downward debt spirals. So you're going to make it harder to help them. So please practice patience, let us do no harm, and thank you for the work that you do. With that, I think I'll open it up for Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Wary. I am going to be facilitating the question and answers, and I invite folks to continue to put your questions into the chat, or at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. You can press that and also send your questions there. This indeed has raised for me a lot of provoking thought-provoking concepts and ideas. And so maybe I'll start out with the first question. But before I do that, for folks who joined late, I'm Mishi Knight. I'm one of the HIP board members, and I spend my time at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation during the week as a health philanthropist. So one of the questions that come to mind readily, Dr. Wary, is, time and time again, we see statistics that tell us that 63% of Americans don't have enough savings to cover a $500 emergency. And as Carol talked about the interlocking injustices, this has been something that's been going on for years and years and years. And so even as we see this happening, I don't see where school curriculums, for example, have changed to make financial education a fundamental part of what students receive. And so I wonder what thoughts you have there as it relates to, what needs to change within our society, within our educational systems to put us on a different trajectory.
Yeah. So the question of financial education is a difficult one, in part because most of the work that tries to find a causal linkage with financial education fails to find the relationship, and here are some reasons why. So it doesn't mean that we don't need to do a better job with financial education. But what it does mean is that when that financial education is not linked to real resources, it falls flat. And so typically what we are seeing is that when people are in coaching situations, financial coaching situations, and they're also being linked to real services in real time, that those lessons are the ones that tend to stick. And so one of the frustrations when you talk to low and moderate income households with questions of financial education is that some of them will say, I realized that I was going into some really bad debt. The last thing I wanted to know was how bad it was, because I didn't feel as if I had the option not to go into it. And so one of the things that happens is when you start asking them, well, did you investigate how bad the debt would be for you? And then their response is, it was better for me not to know. And part of the reason it was better for them not to know is that their decision about whether or not to take on the debt had less to do with what they knew and more to do with who they cared about. And so when we look at sort of panels of individuals and we control for education and occupation, and we look at how many of those people have family members who are in financial need, those are people who find their savings being depleted. And so you have these sort of network effects on sort of savings and financial behaviors. And so we're not, the individual may have his or her own goals, but those goals are derailed as soon as the parents need something, and particularly where parents have inadequate retirements, or when they have children or siblings or nieces and nephews in need. Suddenly the last thing they want to do is talk about the numbers. And so they will just sort of say, they will kind of tone it down, sort of the negative effects of whatever deal they've taken, even knowing that that what they're saying isn't quite true, because once you've made a decision and you know that you're going to take that decision whether or not it's good for you, then you're kind of stuck. And so you're trying to sort of still maintain faith, maintain a favorable sense of self, even while making decisions that you know are harmful.
Thank you so much. And another question that just came in is, in your view, how much of the American reliance on credit has to do with the long-term effects of wage suppression?
Yeah. There have been people who have done work on this, and I have not. So reliance on credit in this country is something that has allowed for the shifting of the social safety net. And so if you're in a sort of a bad financial situation and you're having trouble feeding your family, you have credit. And so one of the difficulties is there are people who are using credit for basic things like groceries and to sort of keep utilities going. There are other people who are using something other than credit, which is skipped payments. And so one of the groups that gets let off scotch-free are some of our utilities, for whom a skipped payment or a set of late payments can mean really exorbitant hookup fees. So they will fully disconnect and need to fully reconnect, and the reconnection fee will sometimes cost more than what was owed on the bill. And so this is to say, sorry for me sort of going on and on about the credit and its relationship to the social safety net. But this is to say that in a country where much of our social safety net is shared with families and with individuals and nonprofits, credit has just become indispensable. And one of the difficulties with trying to sort of tell people not to take mainstream credit is that they're going to find a way to finance those needs. And when they're not being able to sort of use a provider who is a little bit more above board and a little bit more accountable, they're going to use other providers that are going to mean that their financial insecurity is worse than it would have been.
Yeah. So you said a few things there that hit a couple of points for me, and one of them is this idea that, you know, the choice you make is based on the choice you have is the choice you make.
Mm-hmm.
And in our country where social services are underfunded typically, I wonder, someone posed a question here that's asking, what is the best way to establish long-lasting community networks to protect vulnerable groups?
So I'm the bottom up guy, and so when people ask me what's the best way to establish long-term community networks, I sort of point to long-term community networks, and then I say go ask them. And the other thing too to keep in mind is that these community networks are happening in really different policy environments, and so. You have some municipalities that are going to just make it a lot easier for community networks to be effective, and then are going to make it a lot harder for sort of predatory actors to sort of go on with business as usual. So one example that's been presented to me has been the fact that the county courts can make a really big difference, particularly for things like debt collection and for people who are facing eviction. So if you make the cost of filing and the process of filing, if it's a little more difficult for them, then they tend to sort of look to other options before deciding to throw people out of their apartments. I've known people on the other side of that where they've been landlords and had really terrible tenants, and you know they're not happy about it. But on balance, they basically said that what the general notion is, so long as it's not outrageous and you give people some reasonable options for how they're going to sort of work out some of these problems and disagreements, then making it harder to sort of throw people out of their apartments is like a good start. But I'll end it with that for now.
Yeah. So I want to pick up on the predatory lending. And part of what you talked about earlier too was the incentives, if you will, that are on the part of these big banking institutions. And so when they do these debt collection practices, for example, they're able to earn significantly more than, you know, others who are probably, you know, just bricks and mortars, your community bank kinds of establishments. And so I wonder what you think about the incentives and the policies that lend to that. And it feels like the tables are stacked, the cards are stacked against the consumer in some of these situations. And how do you start to right that? How do you start to turn the ship? Are there places that, you know, take on some of these debt and then forgive it, or what's happening in that space?
Yes. So one area that's been fruitful has been there's a group at Pew Charitable's Trust, that's their small dollar loan program, and one of the things that they've tried to document is how do you sort of make short-term small dollar lending both feasible for those providing those loans, but not predatory. And they look to the example in Colorado. So one of the typical objections to regulating these predatory lenders is that people actually need the credit. So you don't want credit to dry up. And what they found was that if you can actually come up with some reasonable interest rates and you get rid of one of the problems with these predatory loans is that there was a balloon payment at the end. And so sort of a short-term loan, you pay it off in 2 weeks, and you know you can't pay it off in 2 weeks. And at the end, you have to pay the balloon payment. The other payments are really affordable, so you get the balloon payment, you can't pay it, so you have to roll it over, renew it. And you just keep doing that. And so what they did was they got rid of the balloon payment, they turned it into an installment loan that would last for a minimum of 6 months or something like that. And suddenly you had people who were able to get reasonable credit. I think it was 30-some% interest rate. And the credit didn't dry up. What happened instead, so the amount of people able to get credit was roughly the same. The number of providers basically got cut in half, but the providers who remained nearly doubled in size. And so this meant that providers had to get lean and they and had to take advantage of scale. And that's what they did. And so in this case, instead of going to the consumers and telling them to sort of get a better education and figure out that this is a really bad deal, they went to the providers and they said, we know that this loan is designed so it just keeps getting renewed over and over again at an outrageous APR. We're gonna sort of call it what it is and make it stop. And that's what they did. Ohio and Virginia have taken a similar route. And so I think part of what this tells us when we look at places like Ohio and Virginia is, you know, you can have this can happen in all sorts of states. It's not just in places where we typically think of as sort of lots of liberals. And so part of it is trying to figure out, are there a set of reasonable policies that we've seen work? And can we take advantage of having a federal system to sort of launch experiments to see what might work? And be okay with, okay, maybe we were wrong, but we tried and we took the lesson from the failures where we had them. And so I think that's the approach that's being taken now with predatory lending. Hopefully there'll be a similar spirit of experimentation when it comes to keeping people in their homes.
Great. So it sounds like your work allows you a national lens. And there's a question that's coming in here that's asking specifically about Mercer County, but I'll broaden it a bit to say New Jersey. Mm-hmm. And what does the numbers look like in New Jersey? Like, what is the story that we are telling in the state around debt and dignity and mistakes? And yeah.
So the National Center for Consumer, the National Consumer Law Center, that's who they are. What they have found is that for debts that have been turned over to debt collectors, I'm just going to check quickly. Overall, it looks as if we're talking about 28% of New Jerseyans have debts in collection. and but when we look at predominantly white versus non-white areas, that's going to be 44% of non-white areas, and only 20% of white areas are going to have households have debts in collection. And so that's typically what it looks like. And if we're looking at sort of any debt, the median debts that we're talking about that are turned in collections in New Jersey, a little over $1,100 at the median. And so, you know, depending on who you are, you would say it's not actually a whole lot of money, but this is what people are facing. There are some protections for people when they are in that much debt. But what we're finding when we look at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's public-facing database is that a lot of consumers are saying that those protections are not being honored. So, for example, there are restrictions on calling your employer, for example, but debt collectors are doing it anyway. And so what we're seeing in that database, and with the group of students at Princeton, we reviewed about a little over 4,000 narrative complaints to the Bureau, and then we did a close reading of roughly 500 of them. But what people were describing were phone calls made to their, in one case, it was to the boss's cell phone, personal cell phone. And so, so part of what then happens is those who are sort of most vulnerable then find themselves worried about whether or not they're going to even be able to stay in their jobs because of their debt. Also find that they're embarrassed when they go to work because their coworkers and their boss is pressuring this employee to please get these debt collectors to stop calling here. What in the world did you do? And so these are some of the problems that are happening, and the enforcement is relatively weak.
Yeah. So in this time, I think a lot of people will say we are experiencing a trifecta of disparities with COVID-19, and in light of many social injustices playing out around the country. And during this time period, especially at the outset of COVID, there had been moratorium on eviction, for example. And so we know that once we start to get back to business as usual, there will be significantly more people unemployed and significantly more people who are going to be called on to pay for the back money, all of what had been, you know, put on pause during this period. And with your work, I wonder, what are you thinking about now? What are the things that give you energy? Where are the places you want to lean into to think about where change can happen, or what's exciting you?
Yes. So I think some of the things that for me are exciting, what's exciting? I guess one of the things that's exciting is that because the pandemic arrived in the way that it did, and so you had lots of people who suddenly, you couldn't leave your house, you couldn't go to work. So suddenly the discussion about people who suddenly don't have money is not a discussion about people who don't want to work, or the general stereotypes that go along with who is deserving and who is undeserving of assistance. Suddenly we just had to say, okay, there may be some ne'er-do-wells in the bunch, but we think most of the people who are experiencing these hardships right now are somehow deserving of attention. So that was a glimmer. I think the second glimmer that comes with that is sort of a realization about the things that we don't know. And so one of the things that we really don't know is there a way of providing assistance that's both affirming and that's more likely to lead people to sort of, in their future actions, do things that are going to be more positive than negative for their financial security. Because one of the problems is that we've been so focused on sort of, if there is a lack of resources, we just fix the quantitative amount of what needs to be fixed. We say, you're in $1,100 worth of debt, we just need to get you $1,100. And one of the things that we don't ask is there a way in which assistance is delivered that can actually be empowering for someone going forward, that can make them sort of lift the chin up and look to sort of do other things in their life going forward that are going to be more positive for them than negative. So I think if we can pay attention to that piece, to the dignity piece, then we're more likely to sort of have assistance that has a multiplying effect in the positive.
Excellent. This has been a most fascinating conversation. I thank you for your time. And thank you all for your questions. Carol, I'm turning things over to you.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Mishi, for your adept Q&A. And thank you, Professor Worry, for your insights. You definitely echo some of the issues that we at HIP face, the families that we help with emergency rental assistance particularly, that trying to empower and treat people with the dignity they deserve is something we do strive to do. And I appreciate very much you're saying that with this pandemic, that there are going to be more and more people who previously, you know, were able to make it and are going to be looking for help. So, as you know, everyone, HIP is committed to helping Princeton be a diverse and inclusive community. We provide emergency rental assistance to people who've experienced a setback like a lost job, or, you know, a broken down car, a sick child. But the pandemic and the economic dislocation resulting has made our mission even more crucial. There was an editorial in today's Star Ledger that pointed out that as many as 40% of New Jersey households have someone in the home that has lost their job due to COVID. And for the poorest people, it's 50%, with a disproportionate impact on Black and Latino families. And these unemployed people or underemployed people, in some cases, can't pay their rent. Beginning in September, the $100 million in emergency rental assistance that Governor Murphy committed to respond to the crisis will begin being distributed, but it is estimated that it will be able to help about 10 to 15,000 families. And we know that there are 1 million renters in New Jersey, half of which are struggling to pay their rent now. And the words tsunami and avalanche are the words that I keep hearing to predict the rate of evictions once the moratorium on evictions is lifted. HIP wants to be there to help these families avoid eviction and stay safely in their homes and weather this crisis until they can get back on their feet, get the jobs back, and things get back to some kind of normal. Your support has always helped, and we really, really appreciate your support. As you may know, we're an all-volunteer organization, and we're always looking for more volunteers. So if you're at all interested in helping with our work, please go to our website, which is housinginitiativesofprinceton.org. And there's a place to sign up to be a volunteer. And if you're able, please consider donating again to HIP. There's a link, I think it's in the chat box now, that you can use to go to our website, and you can make a donation right now, or you can go to the website later and at your convenience make a donation, and we would really appreciate it. And you can always, of course, send a check to 33 Mercer Street, HIP 33 Mercer Street, Princeton. You know, it's an important moment in our country and, of course, for this community. And we can all decide together what kind of future we're going to build and what it's going to look like. And we can tap into our empathy, which is, I think, a little bit of what Professor Wary was talking about when we talk about treating people who may have made some mistakes with dignity to help them rectify their mistakes. I really want to thank a few people who helped make this virtual event possible, particularly Judy and Mark Sarvery for graciously hosting us in their beautiful garden, Professor Wary, again, thank you. Your research is very interesting and very relevant to the work that we do here at HIP. I want to thank the musicians, John, Gabrielle, and Victoria Zamet, and Samuel Weinglass. Lily Pies for the delicious scone mix, and all the people on HIP, the team that put this together, which is Jason Rode, Kathleen Gittleman, Deborah Agnew, Sarah Torian, and Mishi Knight. And of course, you guys, thank you so much for trying this out, being here today, supporting the work of HIP. And we really, really appreciate it. And I will turn it back to the beautiful garden at Judy Sarvery's house. Judy.
Thanks, Carol. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. We were happy to help. I would like to thank HIP board member Deborah Agnew for coming and socially distancing with me here, and all the rest of the HIP committee who very adeptly switched this from a garden party to a bring your own garden party. I think it's probably first of a kind. So thank you all for participating. And I'm sure we will meet again.
Well, Judy and Mark, I'd like to thank you so much. The Queen may not have had her garden parties, but we've had an absolutely lovely time here. So thanks for having us. It's been wonderful.
No problem.
So I'll see you soon.
Yes.
And those of you at home who'd like to donate, the website is going to come up on a lovely slideshow of everyone's garden. So thank you and goodbye. Bye-bye.